So, welcome to our today's event, which is part of the 30 Post-Soviet Years series, which we, that is the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, organize in cooperation with the Körber Foundation, the German Association for East European Studies, the German Historical Museum Institute Moscow, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Russia, and Memorial International. In this series of events, we revisit the watershed year of 1991 and examine legacies of the Soviet era. 1991, however, did not only mark the end of the Soviet Union, but also the beginning of the breakup of Yugoslavia. So what could be more interesting than bringing people together that discuss both of these topics? And that's exactly what we will do tonight. I'm very happy to welcome the author Lana Vastasic, who was born in Zagreb, Croatia, grew up in Banja Luka, Bosnia, and studied there and in Belgrade, Serbia. Lana was awarded the 2020 European Union Prize for Literature for her first novel, Catch the Rabbit, which we will discuss today. I also welcome Andrei Kurkov, who's a Russian-speaking writer from Ukraine. Andrei has published more than 30 books, which were translated into 37 languages. Today, we will find out more about his latest novel, Grey Bees. Our panel is completed by Sabine von Lovis, who is a geographer and a senior researcher at ZOIS, and Nina Stefanov, who is a historian and coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Center Crossing Borders at Humboldt University. My name is Nina Fries. I'm a scholar for Slavic literature and culture and a researcher at ZOIS. Before we will hear two first bits of the novels we will discuss later, I would like to ask both authors, would you agree with labeling your respective novels as post-Yugoslav and post-Soviet text? Why not? Lana, would you like to start?
Hi, Nina, and hi, everybody who is watching, and thank you for having me here tonight or this morning for Andrei. It's an interesting question. I'm really curious what Andrei will answer. I think definitely the post-Yugoslav tag is something me and my fellow writers from former Yugoslavia cannot escape. I don't think we should be escaping it. I do think that informs our writing in a way, but I also hope that my book is seen as European, because not only because of the countries and cities and the geography that appears in the book, but also because I think our problems or everything that Bosnia and former Yugoslavia have gone through, I think they're also important for Europe, for European identity as a whole. And I think it's important to see us also as Europe, not always to be pushing us aside as something else. So I would say yes, post-Yugoslav, but also European.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lana. Andrei, would you go on, please?
Well, it's indeed a difficult question. I don't like this notion post-Soviet, and I'm reluctant to acknowledge that my book is post-Soviet, but at the same time, I know that I'm myself post-Soviet and Ukraine is post-Soviet, and the war in Donbass, actually, it's the war between contemporary or new Ukraine with the Soviet Union still, because we still have a lot of Soviet people among the population. And I'm sure we have Soviet people even in the parliament. So, I mean, my novel is contemporary because it is about what is happening now, although it was written first 4 years ago. Yeah, probably, I mean, you feel free to decide whether it is post-Soviet or not. I don't want to think about labeling my novel as post-Soviet. But since the topic and since one of the characters, or maybe both of the main characters, are very post-Soviet people with typical post-Soviet mentality, so yes, you pressed me to acknowledge it.
Oh, that wasn't my idea, but thank you so much for going into detail about this. Okay, we will now hear the first part of our reading. Lana, would you like to start with chapter 5 from Catch the Rabbit?
Yes, I'm really sad that I can't speak or read German because I've been told that Rebecca's translation is very good. So I will be reading from the English translation, which is my own. So this is chapter 5. And then silence. Her naughty legs covered with blue yellowish bruises, dusted with crumbs from the chips she wolfed down in 2 minutes without offering me a single one. The shimmering wedding band dancing in the air between our heads. I wanted to do something, hit the brakes and send her through the windshield, or at least park somewhere, take my suitcase and head down the road on foot. I would have walked to Dubrovnik if necessary, until she swallowed her pride and yelled my name, admitting she needed me. But I didn't do anything. I drove fast, but with care, afraid that something might slow us down, that we would never reach Jablanica, let alone Vienna, that Michael would be barefoot forever. I don't know the names of trees. I only remember that they were silently observing us as we were running away. Their trunks were straight and quiet, like they had come to our funeral. I didn't want to stop, although I had to use the restroom. I wanted to say something, but was stuck between two Laylas, the one I had known my whole life, who once waxed my crotch, and this stranger with bleached hair and slutty clothes, blowing her gum bubbles and letting them burst across her face. I can't recall half my childhood, yet I remember the details of her with irritating clarity. Blue bubble gum, watermelon flavor, a scratch on her left knee, cracks in the red lips. One time she had told me that writers write because they don't have memories of their own, so they make some up. That was before, while Rabbit was still alive, and we had just started reading books. But she wasn't right, at least not entirely. Memories might be like a frozen lake to me, blurry and slippery, but every now and then there is a crack in its surface, and I can put my hand through it and catch a detail, a recollection in the cold water. But frozen lakes are vicious. Sometimes you catch a fish, other times you fall through and drown. I know from experience that all my memories of her tend towards the latter. That's why I had done my best not to remember for 12 years. And it worked. When it comes to our humanity, it's amazing the low levels to which we can sink when it suits us. I think it's enough. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for giving us this first impression, and we will go on with Andre, who will read the first chapter of Grey Bees. Andre, you have to switch on your microphone.
Yes, I don't want to read to myself only. Sergei Sergeyevich was aroused by the cold air at about 3 in the morning. The pot-belly stove he had cobbled together in imitation of a picture in Cozy Cottage magazine, with its little glass door and 2 burners, had ceased to give off any warmth. The 2 tin buckets that stood by its side were empty. He lowered his hand into the nearest of them, and his fingers found only coal dust. All right, he groaned sleepily, put on his trousers, slid his feet into the slippers he had fashioned out of an old pair of felt boots, pulled on his sheepskin coat, took both buckets and went into the yard. He stopped behind the shed in front of a pile of coal, and his eyes landed on the shovel. It was much brighter out here than inside. Lumps of coal poured down, thumping against the bottoms of the buckets. Soon the echoing thumps died away, and the rest of the lumps fell in silence. Somewhere far off, a cannon sounded. Half a minute later, there was another blast, which seemed to come from the opposite direction. Fools can't get to sleep, Sergei said to himself, probably just warming their hands. Then he returned to the dark interior of the house and lit a candle. Its warm, pleasant, honeyed scent hit his nose, and his ears were soothed by the familiar quiet ticking of the alarm clock on the narrow wooden windowsill. There was still a hint of heat inside the stove's belly, but not enough to get the frosty coal going without the help of wood chips and paper. Eventually, when the long bluish tongues of flame began to leak at the smoke-stained glass, the master of the house stepped out into the yard again. The sound of distant bombardment, almost inaudible inside the house, now reached Sergei's ears from the east. But soon another sound drew his attention. He heard a car driving nearby. Then it stopped. There were only two proper streets in the village, one named after Lenin, the other after Taras Shevchenko, and also Ivan Michurin Lane. Sergei himself lived on Lenin in less than proud isolation. This meant that the car had been driving down Shevchenko. There, too, only one person was left, Pashka Khmelenko, who, like Sergei, had retired early. The two men were almost exactly the same age and had been enemies from their first days at school. Pashka's garden looked out towards Gorlivka, so he was one street closer to Donetsk than Sergei. Sergei's garden faced in the other direction, towards Slavyansk. It sloped down to a field which first dipped, then rose up towards Zhdanivka. You could not actually see Zhdanivka from the garden. It lay hidden behind a hump, but you could sometimes hear the Ukrainian army, which had burrowed dugouts and trenches into the hump. And even when he could hear the army, Sergei was always aware of its presence. It sat in the dugouts and trenches to the left of the forest plantation and the dirt road along which tractors and lorries used to drive. I don't know, maybe I should stop here or...
Yeah, I think this gives us a fine first impression from the novel. What is
I just want to mention that actually he lives there with his bees. He has 6 beehives. He is a retired miner who is a beekeeper. And in this war, he is trying to defend his bees. And he is confused about which side to support.
Thank you. Okay, so my first question goes to Lana. Yeah, so your novel Catch a Rabbit is what one could call a post-Yugoslav, again, road movie. Two young women, Sarah and Leila, travel from Mostar in Bosnia to Vienna in Austria to meet Leila's lost brother. At least that's what Leila pretends. The novel tells the story of their trip in the literary presence, but also of their, one has to say, former friendship in the 1990s, early 2000s. For Sarah, who immigrated to Ireland, it's the first time after 12 years that she comes back home to her home country, which seems to be a rather disturbing experience for her. You found a very interesting way to express the inner trouble the young woman feels. While Leila and Sarah are in Bosnia, no matter what time it is always dark, or almost always dark. So how did you find this strong metaphor, and what does it mean to you?
Thank you, Nina. I mean, when I set out to write this book, I didn't want to write any kind of realist account of the country. I didn't want to write a political essay. You can hear the Zurich bells; they're very loud. I apologize. I wanted to write fiction, and I wanted this fiction to have a storyteller, and that's Sara. And Sara is somebody who is inventing as she goes. And I wanted the reader to always remember that what he or she is reading is fiction, and that only in fiction we can use these different literary devices to show some emotions. So even when it's fantastical, even when it's not real per se, there is something real about the feeling. And for the narrator, Bosnia is a dark place, or the place that she decided to leave in the dark. And this darkness has many different functions in the novel. It's also the darkness of the people who live there and who chose and still choose not to see all the problems, and they choose to be blind, and they choose not to see nationalism and fascism, which is still there. And it's also this kind of darkness, which is almost like radiation, which when you grow up in a country like that, you feel like no matter where you go, you kind of take it inside you, like you have been poisoned in a way. But at the same time, this darkness feels like the only home you will ever know. So there were many different reasons, but these are, let's say, some of them. And just to tell our listeners, it's not always dark in Bosnia. The sun comes out. It's just fiction.
Yes, it's very impressive, and it also at first leaves the reader a little bit disturbed behind, because he or she doesn't know from the very beginning what's going on, what's happening. But this makes it even more interesting. And what I found very interesting is that the absence of light and color is a topic in Andrei's latest novel, Grey Bees. So it's even included in the title as well. And as we have already heard from Andrei, this novel tells the story of Sergej, who's a beekeeper, and who, at least in the beginning of the story, lives in a Donbass area in a so-called gray zone. Later on, he leaves this gray zone because he worries about his bees, as Andrei told us, and heads for Crimea, occupied by the Russian Federation, where he spends the summer together with his bees. At the end of the novel, Sergej returns to his village in the gray zone. Andrei, could you very briefly explain what this term gray zone means, and why you decided to set parts of your novel in this gray zone?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I didn't plan to write this novel. And when I was asked, even 2 years after the beginning of the war, whether I'm writing something on the topic, I was saying, no, I will wait until the war is over, and maybe 20 years more, in order to understand what it was, and and the consequences of this war. But after the war, we had an influx of internal refugees, and at some point we had 1.5 million of refugees from Donbass and some from Crimea in central and western part of Ukraine. And I started meeting people from Donbass in Kiev, and my friends brought a young man to a party who was a Donbass businessman, a young man who moved to Kiev, and he told me 4 years ago or 5 years ago, 4 years ago, yeah, that he goes back almost every month, and he tries to visit acquaintances in a village which is practically almost on the edge of the gray zone. And the people who live there, who remain there, they don't have post office, no bank, no access to shops, of course, no post, and he is bringing them medications and things they need, and they're trying to survive, and they have allotment, and they pickle vegetables, and he buys these vegetables from them and brings them to sell in Kiev. And that shocked me, this story, and I just decided to research a bit more, and I went 3 times in the war zone starting from 2015. And I realized that the gray zone, which is actually the widest strip of front line, has the same length as front line, 427 kilometers. In some places, this gray zone or no man's land is 300 meters wide, sometimes even several kilometers wide. And inside this gray zone, there are villages abandoned and not abandoned. And even there is a part of a town, industrial town of Avdiivka is considered gray zone. So I mean, after this, I wanted to tell about this drama, about people who don't want to leave their houses, although it is dangerous, although I mean they are left behind by everybody, and everybody from both sides can come and do whatever they want. And so I came up to this character, and now actually from the gray zone to the gray mentality, I would say, because in fact, I mean, the gray zone begins inside the head of a person who doesn't have a concrete idea which country or which nation or where he belongs to. Or maybe it's enough for him to know that he lives in Donbass and he is a local patriot, but if he doesn't or she doesn't have political affiliation with the country or emotional affiliation, it means that this person is somehow present and absent at the same time. So he wants to be unnoticed. And in Donbass, actually, for majority of people, it was old Soviet tradition not to stand up, not to stand out, not to be noticed, just to have quiet life, not to disturb anybody and not to be disturbed. And the war made several million of people first time to think where they belong, what they want with their life, and what costs, I mean, what is the cost of life? What is the cost of political ideas, etc. And so I should say that I travel a lot in Ukraine, and I met people with this gray mentality in Bessarabia, in Zakarpattia, in every region. There are people who just, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to say they are bad people. They are normal, ordinary people who want only to, I mean, they don't care about politics until politics start actually destructing their life and attention. And I wanted actually to show not in a straightforward way how the reality changes the perception of life, a perception of responsibility in a person.
Thanks a lot for that. And we will go on with another part of Grey Beans from chapter 8, where we will meet the protagonist once again.
There was a soft knock at the door. Well, look at that, Sergei said to himself with a grin. You help a person out and they start acting a little more civilized. He picked up a burning candle from the table and went to let Pashka in. But when he unlocked and opened the door, he was met by the evening darkness and a figure with a face that was not Pashka's. It was a younger face with tense eyes that reflected the church candle's flame. Sergei froze. And as he stood there, he gradually realized that the stranger was wearing camouflage and had an automatic rifle slung over his shoulder with its short barrel pointed at the ground. Forgive me, I know it's late and unexpected, the stranger said with a note of polite embarrassment. Sergei understood that the stranger was unlikely to kill or rob him, otherwise why apologize? He sighed and brought the candle in his left hand closer to the uninvited guest, who was very young indeed, maybe 22 or 23. May I come in? The stranger said. Sure, if you take off your boots and leave the rifle by the door, Sergei said in an exaggeratedly stern manner, though he sensed that his voice was on the verge of trembling with fear. He was, after all, ordering a soldier to hand over his weapon. I can take off my boots, the young man said, but I am not allowed to abandon my weapon. All right, the boots will do, Sergei said. He shut the door, lowering the iron latch and hook, glanced at the pair of tall boots by the wall, then invited the stranger to sit at the table. A little vodka, he said out of politeness, then mentally smacked himself in the mouth for showing such excessive hospitality. No, thanks, the young man shook his head, but I'd take some tea. Sergeyevich nodded. Tea it is. It seemed to him that one candle was not enough for two people. He took out two more and lit them. Tea it is, he repeated, peering into the stranger's face just to make sure he hadn't missed anything in the light of the single candle. What's your name? Petro. And where are you from? From Khmelnytsky. Ah, Sergej said, sounding as if he had grasped something important. Ukrainian army, then? The young man nodded. Artillery. Petro shook his head. And what is your name? Me? Sergei Sergeyevich. You can call me Sergeyevich, so it's probably Peter, not Petro. No, it's Petro. Says so in my passport. Well, my passport says I'm Sergei Sergeyevich, but I say I'm Sergei Sergeyevich. That's the difference. You probably don't agree with your passport, Petro said. No, I agree with my passport, just not with what it chooses to call me. Well, I agree both with my passport and with what it chooses to call me, the guest said with a smile. It was an easy smile, even disarming, although a rifle hung on the back of his chair. Maybe you agree because the name in your passport is the same as your name in life, Sergej said thoughtfully. If that were the case with me, I wouldn't quarrel with my passport either. So tell me, Petro, to what do I owe this visit? You want something from me? That's right, the young man said. I wanted to get acquainted. I've seen you for more than a year now, but I didn't know your name. Where have you been seeing me? Sergej said, taken aback. Through my binoculars, the young man replied, a little hesitantly. I'm supposed to observe the village. I would have come earlier, but it's dangerous in the daytime. I'm not really allowed to come in the dark either, but it's less risky. What sort of danger do you expect from us in the daytime? From you personally, none, but from the snipers who've got our nerves shot and would like to do the same for our heads, plenty. Just 3 days ago, they were taking pot shots at us from the church. Nobody comes through here, Sergej stated with conviction. I would have seen their tracks. I don't sit at home all day, you know. 4 killed this year, 3 wounded, Petro said calmly, scratching behind his ear. Then he awkwardly placed his green balaclava on the tabletop. Sergej made the tea. He poured a cup for his guest and one for himself. So how is it there in Ukraine, he said. Enough lard for everyone. Oh, sure, the young man could not help but smile. I sometimes get a bit too. Volunteers drive it over. As for the country, same as always. People getting ripped off, streets and towns renamed, but they say things will improve after the war. We won't need permission to go abroad. If you don't get yourself killed, you mean, Sergej said, his lips curling. But then he caught himself. That almost made it sound like he was wishing someone dead. He decided to change the subject. What names are they changing? Haven't you heard? Petro's eyes opened wide and a smile revealed strong teeth. Oh, I forgot. You don't have any power, so no TV. The host nodded sadly. Yeah, power has been out for a long time. Maybe they will come and fix it. I doubt it. Too dangerous now. And it's probably better that you don't watch TV anyway. Save your nerves. Don't worry about me. I've got nerves of steel, Sergej boasted. I was a safety inspector in the mines. You have any idea what that requires? The young man's eyes showed a spark of admiration. And what did you do before all this? Sergej asked. Tourism, hospitality. Wanted to move down to Crimea, build a little hotel. A little late for that, Sergej lamented, waving his hand. I have never been to Crimea myself. Always wanted to go, though. Take a dip in the sea, lie around on a beach, come back tanned. I've got a friend down there. We met at a beekeeping convention, a Tatar, name's Ahtem Mustafayev. Beekeeper like me, keeps inviting me, but it hasn't worked out. Well, someday, the young man said, perhaps in an effort to console Sergej.
Thank you so much. And indeed, Sergej will make it to Crimea. So time to bring in the researchers we also have here in our panel. Sabine, in your research, you're also dealing with the life in border regions, but also in gray zones and de facto states. So could you please tell us what are the particularities of living in such areas? I mean, we just got a little insight into life in such areas, but what's your what does your research say?
Well, thank you, Nina. Yeah, we'll try. I mean, I think the book already tells very well the situation in the gray zone, and there's actually not so much research about the gray zone. And I can try to. I mean, it's a big complex, and it all belongs to this contact line, or so-called contact line, which has been the front line and evolved out of a ceasefire line. And as Andri described it, it is an area both parties claim. It separates the so-called non-government areas from the non-government controlled areas from the government controlled areas. And these gray zones are the areas in between where both parties claim, so the Ukrainian forces and the separatist forces backed up by Russia. So nobody really controls this area. So as Andrei Kokov described it, there's no electricity, there's no services, there's nobody really taking care of those people living there. And it's I mean, it's really ambitious and great that someone has written about people living there and trying to survive in this situation. And they come around non-government organizations to support these people, and also international organizations to provide them with some resources. And also this guy, Sergej, plans his return because he waits for the coal in winter. At least he says that when he returns to Crimea, that he has to be there again to receive some coal to heat for the next winter. So and then beyond this gray zone is a special area between, and we also said that it can be 300 meters or 3 kilometers, and then we have these contact points in between where you still have these 5 contact points along the line where you still can cross more or less secure, and where you also have some infrastructure, and those is where the places where people go to get maybe products or to get medical care. But beyond that, there's not much infrastructure in a former war area or a still war area. And what also comes out well in the book, that if you move between places, what you do not very often, this is a mined area, so you have to be careful. You carefully plan where to go and when to go if you need to go to another place, and then somehow you probably move out of this gray zone and this will be described later in the book, if you come to a contact point or a checkpoint, when you get checked your identity, and then you cross to an area where it's control either the black or the white side, however you want it, and you move away from the gray to the either black or white. And there are many of those controls, and it's a very special area. And we did some research with a local researcher, and she did not exactly go to the gray zone, but she catched ideas and perceptions and the situation of life of people at these contact points, and also in situations where there's no contact possible across the line. And she also got voices why I was thinking that are similar to this Sergei when he leaves the area to the proper Ukraine, so to say, where he is met with suspicion because he comes out of this gray zone only because he comes from this area. And yeah, I was wondering also, Enrico, you described this person a little bit, I don't know, a bit negative, that he does resist to define his identity because he feels mixed, and I think that's quite okay. And and he finally, at the end of the book, when he learns about life in Ukraine and he could move in a place with a woman in the proper Ukraine area, or he could stay in Crimea or wherever, but somehow he does not want to live there. He returns at the end of the book to the gray zone, and I was wondering why he does it. I mean, you describe it somehow negatively. He does not want to decide, but I think in another direction, does he really have to? But this is maybe
do you want me to answer now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, he has a choice in the, I mean, he is divorced. His wife and daughter live in Vinica, in big city, and they always wanted to live there. They are from there. And she couldn't actually survive in this Donbass village because she was a city girl, and he was refusing to move out. I mean, he has this exaggerated feeling of sense of belonging. And he is extremely worried that when he leaves the village, Malasta-Horodivka, to go to Ukraine proper and then to Crimea, he's leaving his enemy or frenemy, enemy who became friend, behind, the only person responsible for survival of the village. So all the time he thinks that actually if something happens to this Pashka and village is empty, nobody will come back. So he still sort of keeps hoping that the war will be over and people will come back and life will restore to the same way. And it's not only about local patriotism, but it's about cliches which exist in Ukraine. And we have two main political cliches created by politicians, but not without help of local radical elites. So the cliche number one is that people from Donbass are bandits and rough, and of course Russian speaking and pro-Soviet, etc. And the cliche number two, all people from Western Ukraine are Nazis and Banderovцы, and they want all Russian speakers out of the country. So I mean, like there is some kind of almost subconscious fear that you won't be happy in the other place. And actually, when he goes to Zaporizhia region, first with the base from the gray zone and crossing into Ukraine, he likes it there, but then he is confronted with the fact that he is from Donbass, which means he doesn't belong there, and probably he was supporting separatists if even he was not a separatist. So his car is vandalized by a disturbed veteran of the war who gets drunk and actually who wants him out of their village.
Thank you. I think we will leave the bees for a moment and go back to the rabbit. And I would like Lana to read some more from chapter 7.
It was a really interesting discussion. I would like to continue, and so I won't keep you up too long. Having said goodbye to Mrs. Knežević, who had wiped her hands on her purple apron in order to give me a big hug, we went to the Avnoi Museum as I had promised. It was cold there in that silly mute meeting with its empty chairs. Layla trailed her fingertips over the wooden benches and chairs, chipped blue nail polish, a white bun on top of her head like a sleeping polar animal. I was looking at her. She was looking at flags, Russia, the United States, a mole I had forgotten on the back of her neck, Great Britain, France, that day on the island, she floating on the surface of the water, Yugoslavia, and some people around us, silent nostalgics with frozen smiles and cell phones in the air, taking pictures of history, taking pictures of pictures, Comrade Marx, Comrade Stalin. I took my own phone from my pocket, one photo for Michael, but the battery was empty and the phone went black the second I unlocked it. I would have to remember the place the best I could. No help from technology, not because of the stone giant frowning in the corner or the anti-fascist declaration of the peoples of Yugoslavia. I would have to remember it for her sake, for Layla. What if she too split apart into pieces of old rags, tiny stars and pale colors? She observed all that emptiness with a kind of disappointment, as if she had expected something. Something was supposed to be there. She had been excited before we got in. Her broken international, although she still hadn't learned how to whistle. The morning was dark, a bit less than the previous day, but still deprived of sunlight. Yet inside that building, circular white lamps hung, giving off neon light from a different time. The flags lay flaccid, free from rogue winds. Nothing could wave them anymore. She took the blue chewing gum, the size of a chestnut, out of her mouth and stuck it on the back of Tito's armchair. She gave me a look over her shoulder in order to make sure I had witnessed the transgression. Proud of her minute crime, she smiled crookedly, but something sneaked out from her face and gave her away. One Layla, who couldn't care less, who proved her supremacy by sticking gum on historical artifacts, was overshadowed by a different one who wouldn't admit that she was disappointed. She came there for a reason. The answer was right under my nose and it eluded me, though I was there with her. Even those tourists had disappeared, only the two of us and the big stone marshal who couldn't look us in the eye. Both of them exhausted, Layla and Josip. But there was nothing there, just some dead words laughing at us from the walls. Long live our allies. She was never one for nostalgia. Layla was someone who found the past about as relevant as discarded tampons left behind somewhere in the grass. She would brush memories off her jeans. If it wasn't in front of her, if it wasn't what was coming up, why waste the energy? But there was something there, a story she had believed, and her eyes were defeated. In that pointless room, she resembled a child who had organized a tea party that nobody came to. The seats were empty, plaster was peeling off the walls, a plastic Disneyland, unworthy of the fairy tales that preceded it, a happy meal Yugoslavia. I need to use the toilet, she said quickly and left the room. The whole meaning of that place followed her out. Officers' chairs became nothing more than a pile of old wood. Flags suddenly became rags, as if she had taken Yugoslavia with her. I waited outside in that twilight I couldn't yet grasp, but slowly learned to accept. It was our darkness, something familiar, which fogged our borders and hid the roads. After someone else's light bulbs from another era, someone's dried up Atlantis, the darkness soothed my eyes. It was mine, wrong and repulsive, but still mine. Something real, out of the wrapper, something ours. I think that's enough.
Thank you so much, Lana, for this impressive piece. And before I come back to you, I would like to ask Nenad, for those of us who are not familiar with Yugoslav history, could you briefly explain what kind of place they just visited and what role it did and does play for Yugoslav history and for contemporary memorial culture?
Yes, I will try. I mean, to be very brief, also because I hope some very dear colleagues who I just discovered that they are also listening to us won't be disappointed by my brief explanation. I mean, this Avnoj, Antifašističko veće narodnog oslobođenja Jugoslavije, as it's called, the Anti-Fascist Council of National Liberation of Yugoslavia met just in this small city in Bosnia, in Jajce, and it decided on the foundations of the new federal order of the future Yugoslav socialist state there in November 29, 1943. And this meant that by these decisions of Avnoj, thorough federalization of the new state took place, and also the possibility of how to say, full equality for all Yugoslav peoples, and the gradual strengthening of all federal units. So this was quite the difference to the former Yugoslavia, which was a centralist state. And to keep brief, it also meant that this was at first official holiday, Dan Republike, the Day of the Republic, celebrated in November. I mean, not the best time of the year, but nevertheless. And what happened is that with the withering away of Yugoslavia and the wars in the 90s, this experience of violence, suddenly Jajce, as other places in Yugoslavia, appeared for Yugo-nostalgics, as they are called, to be a place of remembrance and something very warm and reminding them of a peaceful past. And for me, therefore, it was really completely impressive to have this new experience of another generation, that this is actually a completely cold place. No one likes to be that long, and yes, an empty and cold place of artifacts which have no meaning for these generations. And this was, yeah, I mean, this was really impressive, because I have more to do with people who, yes, have an uncritical approach towards this Yugoslavia, and they have also these pictures of Jajce and the waterfalls and all this. And so this is the ambivalence of the place now today.
Lana, is this the reason why this place made it into your novel?
Well, definitely. I think Nenad really described it well. Since I decided to write a road trip, of course, towns and places were to be very important. Why go here and not there? So every place that I chose on their road had some meaning and had to do with the narrator's relationship with Yugoslavia and also Bosnia. So for me, I mean, it was also useful that between Mostar and Banja Luka, you would go through Jajce. And that was the chapter that I used. Since the whole book is kind of a mirror to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, this chapter in Alice is the Mad Tea Party. And for me, this was really interesting, because in the Mad Tea Party, the clock is always showing the same time it stopped. It's paralyzed, and you feel that the people who are participating in the Mad Tea Party have these empty rituals. You know, if you remember Alice in Wonderland, they pour tea into cups that are broken. It doesn't really make any sense. So I decided that in my book for the Mad Tea Party, I would take them to this museum in Jajce. And of course, every time you write a Yugoslav or a post-Yugoslav novel, Andrei was describing these cliches that I really liked, and I think we all have some similar things, which is, it seems like when it comes to the story of Yugoslavia, you either go the nationalist way of, writing the big Serbian epic or whatever, or, the complete nostalgia of, oh, it was such a lovely time. We were all happy. It was sunshine. Everything was perfect, which is what my grandparents and parents would probably say. So I realized I want a third way, because for my generation, we don't remember this country. We only remember, our story starts with the war, and we remember the darkness, and we are sick of listening about how great everything was by those same people whose generation destroyed it. And also it feels like we are somehow to blame that it's no longer great, and we had nothing to do with it. So my generation cannot go either the fascist or nationalist way or just empty nostalgia. We have to look forward. So this is why I wanted my characters to enter this museum, to see it, to see that there's light there, but this light is fake. And they have to, sooner or later, you cannot live in a museum. So they have to leave the museum and they have to keep driving. And my generation actually has to keep driving, and we have to keep moving forward, and not live in somebody else's nostalgia.
Thank you so much. And we will also move forward, and I will ask Andrei about his chapter he just read, when Sergej and his guest Petro discuss questions of decommunization, which, for instance, also includes the renaming of streets. And in the course of the book, Sergej renames the two main and only streets of his village. So Lenin Street becomes Shevchenko Street and Lenin Street and Shevchenko Street. But what he actually does is he interchanges their names. Those Lenin Street becomes Shevchenko Street and Shevchenko Street becomes Lenin Street, which is, of course, a farce. And on a personal note, I would say it's the funniest part of the book. But normally these processes are taken much more seriously. So could you explain what role do these processes of decommunization play for the contemporary Ukrainian society?
Well, I should say that because of the war in Donbass, the topic of decommunization became less heard. But a lot of, I don't think you can find any Lenin Street now in Ukraine. Although maybe in separatist territories, maybe they renamed it back to Lenin, but the idea was to clean Ukraine from the Soviet past, at least superficially, so that people would not see monuments to Lenin and Karl Marx on every corner and would not have their addresses connected to Lenin or Zhukov streets. But we still have a lot of conflicts around this topic, and permanent court proceedings in Kharkiv, for example, where the local council wants to return the prospect of Marshal Zhukov, who was the commander, one of the commanders and biggest Stalin's generals, and in the Second World War. So, I mean, there is definitely active and passive opposition or to renaming of the streets. And another mission of the renaming to bring into the reality forgotten or banned names of Ukrainian activists, dissidents, and religious leaders, etc. So, I mean, it's trying to reconstruct the living structure of the Ukrainian society, so to give new context to people who live in this structure. Only, I mean, what is not bad, but I mean, what is the main problem with it? That people who grew up in the Soviet time, for them, actually, all this seems like violent acts of refusing or rejecting the past. And this discussion was not really active in Ukraine, I mean, where people could discuss the Soviet part of Ukrainian history. So everything Soviet is removed, and anti-Soviet or new Ukrainian is reinstalled. And I think the process will continue because we still have names of the streets, but streets named after unknown Soviet writers and characters. And of course, with the war with Russia, we still have a lot of Pushkin streets and Tolstoy squares, etc. And so far, nobody is fighting against them. But on Facebook, you can find opinions that they should be renamed because we are now actually enemy countries with Russia. So the story of renaming is not over, but I think it does work for the new generations, because new generation of Ukrainian, they're quite confused sometimes even to answer the question, who was Lenin? So, I mean, the idea is to erase the historical memory, although, I mean, a lot of these people wouldn't know other figures also the people after whom the new streets are named or old streets are renamed. So I should acknowledge that we have a large part of young generation apolitical, who don't want to get involved into politics. And for them, actually, this is some kind of fight over their heads, which reminds what life is in the gray zone, where two sides are firing over your heads, trying to hit each other. But I mean, I understand motivation behind this, and I don't know if there were examples where renaming or sort of changing the historical context through remaining the streets and cities had a very quick and positive effect.
Okay, thank you, Andrei. Sabine, would you like to add a few words from your perspective?
Well, I can try very quickly. I think my internet connection was unstable, and I'm not sure if I listened to everything, but yes, this decommunization process are very typical for many of these post-Soviet and post-socialist countries, and and as Andrei Kokov said, I understand the motivation, but then there are also dangers within it, because in erasing a memory of a past, which is important for many people, does not really erase it, and there's a necessity maybe also to hear about their biographies and to think about what has been good and bad, and there needs a discussion about what has been Soviet and what should be transferred to a post-Soviet or Ukrainian identity, which has also roots in the Soviet past. But I don't want to go too deep into that, and I think it would be interesting to compare this, because we also set up a little bit the session to compare what is this post-Yugoslav development and the post-Soviet. So what is maybe similar
Sabine?
and different in these cases.
Okay, I haven't heard the last part. I think there was a problem with your internet again, but would you like to say it again?
I don't know when.
The very last sentence, I guess. Okay,
maybe this thing of the idea to set up this forum was also to bring into connection the post-Yugoslav and also the post-Soviet experiences and developments. And I think maybe this could be also a question for the later discussion, what is similar and how to deal with this past, which is important for some, but not for others. So.
Lana, would you like to briefly react before we go on with our reading?
Yes, definitely. It's a great question, and I still haven't had a chance, unfortunately, to read Andrei's book, but I'm really curious about it, and I'm amazed how many similar topics we deal with from different perspectives. Of course, whenever there's a war, I think there's also a violence against language, and there's this change of words and change of names, and then you realize that a war is also a kind of story, a kind of fiction, and a kind of fight to who gets to choose the words and choose the language. So I think, Nina, you did a wonderful job of choosing the passages, because precisely the passage that you asked me to read is about the start of the civil war in the war in Bosnia. And one of my characters, who is 11, her mother changes her name from a Muslim name into an Orthodox Christian Serbian name, because they are in Banja Luka and there's a Serbian majority there, and Muslim population is starting to suffer. So I'm just going to read a bit from this beginning of the war. Death is gradual at first and then sudden. In the beginning, dogs died one after another. Their lifeless bodies, still warm in winter morning, followed each other irrevocably, expectedly, the way Wednesday inevitably follows Tuesday. We would find them early before the first news of the day, lying on their sides. A motionless tongue would be escaping from their benign jaws, along with a whole miserable non-human life, but a life nonetheless. It started with Mrs. Ristović's dog. "The tricolor Serbian hunter," she would shout over the fence. She would point at the crooked cross sticking out of the small pile of earth in front of her house and scream, "The tricolor Serbian hunter, the rarest kind. Only jealous pigs could think of that." Back then, crosses sprang up and spread like weed, in backyards, on rear-view mirrors, around our chemistry teacher's fat neck, or tattooed like on Mitter's dad biceps. Then one time he came to a parents' meeting and everybody listened to him as if he were the president, all because of the tattoo. Naturally, dogs were Orthodox Christians and were seen off from this world according to custom. "So what if Father Tedo refused to bury Lux?" Mrs. Ristović went on. "Who says that honest folk can't put a cross where they feel like? Is it something to be ashamed of, to be a Serbian woman?" We would walk back from school through her street and hide our giggles each time she shouted "coulda think" instead of thought. But we felt sorry for Lux, who it later turned out was a tricolor hunter and quite rare, although nobody had ever seen him hunt. Mr. Micho, who lived with his 2 mute daughters in a house with no facade, said that Lux had actually been a Yugoslav tricolor hunter, to which Mrs. Ristović replied that he and Yugoslavia could go fuck themselves. "What you think? Those pigs killed him for being Yugoslav?" she asked, squinting her eyes and crooking her smile, as if suddenly a great truth had been revealed to her only, a truth out of reach for us random mortals with no dead dogs and crosses. "Come on, Bona, don't be ridiculous," Mr. Micho would say, slapping the snow off his Lada. "Me ridiculous? What you think, that this is a coincidence? That scum's gonna poison our food while we're sleeping. First the Serbian tricolor hunters, and then the Serbs, mark my words." She was looking over her fence at us, especially at you, and your new sneakers with 2 colored laces, as if you had strangled the poor dog with them. And Mr. Micho would give us a conspiratorial wink and go back into his house, rubbing his frozen palms. But soon after, Luke's other dogs fell. Mrs. Talić's pug, the bulldog from that overgrown yard, my neighbor's ugly greyhound. In less than a week, there were no dogs left in our block. They were replaced with small, clumsy graves and the sad howling of nobody's cats. Even Mr. Micho stopped kidding around. We would make our way towards the abandoned juice factory, trudging through heaps of snow on the sidewalk. It was that cruel winter around your 11th birthday. You got your period and a new name, whereas I, although 8 months older, got nothing. "Does it hurt?" I asked carefully. You shrugged, as if something like that couldn't be explained to us dry girls. You were different. There was an untouchable wisdom in your attitude, which dictated that you were the leader and I the follower, like we belonged to different suborders of primates. The blood gave you the power to make all decisions. I tried to remind you that I was the older one and therefore should be responsible for both of us, but to you, blood ranked higher than mere time. And when I said that your new name didn't count because it was fake, you didn't blink. "Well, yours is fake too," you said. "You didn't have it when you were born, you only got it later." Until yesterday, you were Layla, bloodless and clean like me. And now this damn Layla snacked into our friendship with her menstruation, which she refused to explain to me. I hated her. Your mother took care to remove the letter G from the front door with a kitchen knife and glued an R instead. It was made of brass, glimmering brand new in your surname, humiliating other letters. You became Leila Beric, just like that, as if it was okay to do that without asking anyone. I tried to convince my parents to rename me Janet. I would be popular at school, like Janet Jackson in that black and white music video when she appears at the glass door and everyone around her stares in awe. You would die of envy. However, my mother told me not to be ridiculous. Janet was the Muslim heaven. Did I want to get my bones broken? Was I okay in the head?
Thank you, Lana. So what I found really interesting is that in this chapter, in its beginning, it's one of the very few passages where violence is mentioned at all in a novel. So why did you decide not to include depiction or direct depiction of the war unless it's almost ever present?
Well, I mean, when you write from a first person perspective, you have to stay true to that point of view. And in this case, the narrator is 12 and she's remembering something that happened when she was 12. So I felt that, you know, I wanted to preserve this child's point of view and this kind of, I'm sorry about the helicopters, and this kind of innocence that a child has. And I remember, because I was a child during the war, you wouldn't think rationally, you know, you wouldn't explain things around you. You wouldn't go saying, okay, there is a civil war going on and Muslim people have to change their names. You would just look at these things as completely nonsensical and try to explain them with the language and the abilities you had. So I wanted to show this war more like this foreign element that comes into their everyday, you know, into their childhood and starts slowly changing things. And they're not yet old enough to describe this or explain it. They just have to live with the consequences. And I wanted the reader to get this child's perspective rather than, you know, giving a huge long-winded explanation of what is going on.
Thank you. So Ninat, it's maybe time to bring you in again.
I was just thinking about what Lana said, considering the violence, because violence is not every time the visible one, but it's also this experience. When I remember, it sounded very awkward to me when we heard in the radio at 1992 or something that some place in Bosnia is liberated or conquered, because I mean, it belonged to all people before. And this meant, on the other side, that it was really conquered. What was conquered was the everyday life before, was conquered by new actors, and this social reality was destroyed. And I think also it is very important not to think about it only in military action, but in the mediation of the results of this violence, which was then creating this completely, okay, for some people it was relevant also before, but for most people, ethnicity was not of that relevance. So it was really conquering their everyday life, and this is the mediated effect of violence. And this is very important, not to think of it only in terms of war and as cruel it was. The siege of Sarajevo is putting into the shadow all the other experiences of other places in Bosnia, and or in other parts of Yugoslavia. So this is really, really very important. And I was really completely impressed by this mediated way to describe it without naming it explicitly. And this is, I think, very, very important to keep in mind when you think about what happened with the destruction of society in Yugoslavia.
Thank you, Ninat. Lana, would you like to react to Nenad?
Well, yeah, just to say that, you know, we've had all these novels, you know, you have the soldiers, you have the bloodshed, you have victimized women, but actually the story has to be told from these other points of view as well, and especially children and those that are left at home. And I think sometimes this childhood perspective gives a clearer idea of what nonsense war is, because the adult will always try to explain it and rationalize it. And I don't think we should ever do that when it comes to war.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. So Andre, on the opposite, the war plays quite a significant role in your novel, at least in the parts that are set in the gray zone. And you mentioned it before that you, in the beginning, didn't want to write about this war. But you decided, you somehow were forced to write about it, to express yourself. So could you let us know how it was for you as a Ukrainian writer to write on an ongoing war, about an ongoing war?
Well, it was difficult. I was actually writing not a war novel, but a human story. For me, actually, the human side of the tragedy, of the drama, of people who found themselves living inside the war is more important in a way than the battle descriptions of battles and bombardments, etc. And I wonder still what an effect will have this war on the future of Ukraine and on the future of people who actually live in these territories, on the Ukrainian governmental side and on the separatist side, because I mean, there are lots of processes going on. There are lots of dramas. I mean, people who escaped to Ukraine, for example, they have their flats and houses nationalized by separatists. So, I mean, like they cut out and they are considered traitors by separatists. So it doesn't have the direct connection with the novel, but generally, I wanted to get inside the brain and the heart of the people who are suffering there. I was asked actually later to write a play based on the theater play based on the first part of the novel about this village with 2 inhabitants. And I went several times myself to see the play, and I was approached a couple of times by the refugees from Lugansk and Donetsk who were telling me that the characters are very typical. The main characters are representative of the local mentality, and that this passivity and waiting for bad things to stop and good things to start, it is still present there, although to lesser extent because there is much more pessimism and less optimism there to find.
Thank you. So we will slowly move on to the last part of our today's discussion. And this is a moment when I would like to encourage our audience to send us questions via chat. But yeah, before we have the questions, we will have a last questions from my side, and then we will move on and hear some last parts, bits from the novels. But before we do so, yeah, I would like to ask the artists whose novels deal with or are about crossing borders, which appeared only very recently, at least in Andrei's case and Lana's novel. They're a little bit older, but not older than 30 years. And I would like to ask them what these new borders mean for them. So Andrei, would you like to start, and we will go on with Lana?
Well, I mean, Frontline, which is the administrative so-called border, for example, with Crimea, for me is a symbol of violence and violation. And I have a strong feeling that I will never go there while it is controlled by Russians. There shouldn't be a border there. Nobody should check me. At the same time, I remember my thoughts and feelings when Soviet Union collapsed and we had a border on Belarusian side, a newly established border with Russia on the eastern side. And at that time, I was, because there was no war, I was more positive, and I liked feeling being a foreigner in Russian Federation. Last time I went to Russia in 2013, and although I spoke the same language, but my words had different meaning, and I talked to, obviously, to foreigners who meant completely different things using the same language than I. And so now with these new frontline borders, it's more like have your arm amputated or your ear cut off. I mean, it's something that makes your own living space smaller. And although, I mean, I know people who are crossing these borders to go there and back, they crossing it from the despair and necessity, not because they want to cross it. So I think there are borders you love and you accept, and you are only judging whether you were treated polite by passport control or impolite, or you were looked down at. And there are borders by crossing which you become prisoner. You go into the darkness. I mean, I loved the episodes of Lana's novel with the darkness, and you go in the darkness where even you cannot see yourself in the mirror. And then the next thing, you want to leave this darkness as quick as possible, not to disappear, because I mean the darkness absorbs. It keeps people who cannot leave the darkness.
Thank you so much, Andrei. Lana, what about you?
Well, for me, it's a very personal question, and it's exactly what Andrei said, that, you know, how borders make your home smaller, because I am, in a way, now in this political situation, a mutant. I'm one of the last Yugoslavs, in a way. I have 3 nationalities. I was born in Yugoslavia and in Zagreb, which now is Croatia. So I have a Croatian nationality, but I'm a foreigner there. They can hear my Bosnian dialect, and I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Bosnia, but then most of my family is Serbian. But I'm also a foreigner in Serbia because of my dialect. And in Bosnia, we were the other because we moved from Croatia. So no matter where we went, we were someone else. And I always felt like if I just took one of those little identities, that's not my whole story. But if I try to use all of these different identities, then they say that I'm a Yugoslav, that I'm a nostalgic, that I'm not anything really what they want to accuse me of. So it's very difficult to even explain, to start to explain what these borders feel like. You know, every time I'm crossing a border, I don't know, between Croatia and Bosnia and Serbia, I have to choose which document to show. And I feel like I'm choosing a part of myself that to that policeman or policewoman would be acceptable. But it's always a part of me. It's never the whole story. And there is some violence there. And then of course there's a question of language, which doesn't really care what we call it. It doesn't care about borders. But we have this thing now that in former Yugoslavia, what used to be known as one language now has 4 different names. And this is making it very, very difficult for us writers to find publishers in the country where they speak the same language, where they do need a translator. It's a completely different system. I have my book published in 3 editions, the completely same text. sometimes it says, in translation, translated from the Bosnian, translated from the Croatian, translated from the Serbian, and it's the same thing. So I just feel like it's, I try to answer this question for myself, where the borders are and who I am and what I am. And now I'm also a European citizen. What does that mean? But there's always something missing. And there's always this feeling, I wish I could just have a simple story, say I'm an Italian from Italy and I speak Italian, but somehow as post-Yugoslav children, we will always come with 11 footnotes, whether we like it or not.
Can I say a few words?
Yes.
I'm ethnic Russian, and I always say I'm Ukrainian because I'm Ukrainian. I have Ukrainian passport, and I remember receiving messages from Russia saying that you are Russian, you should defend Russian sort of culture and Russian interests. And in the end, actually, I was called a traitor of Russian culture. My books are not published in Russia, but in Ukraine, actually, I am, for some Ukrainians, I'm Russian, because I'm ethnic Russian and I write in Russian. So you have to put up with this stuff, and you have to be patient and tolerant, and just decide who you are and keep to this identity and defend this identity you have chosen because of the circumstances and because of the political history of your country.
Thank you, Andrei. I think we will hear now the two last parts of we chose for tonight, and I would like Andrei to start with his reading.
Oh, one moment. It was already getting dark when the cars ahead of him sparked their brake lights and slowed down. He too pressed his brake pedal. About 100 meters down the road, he saw that little concrete pyramids, painted yellow, were narrowing the lane. That's why everyone was driving so carefully, trying not to scratch their cars against the pyramids. He too drove cautiously, at about the speed of a hurrying pedestrian, and stared fixedly at the road. Out of the corner of his eye, he glimpsed camouflaged men with rifles. One of these men took a look at Sergei's Lada with its trailer of beehives, then pressed the talk button on his walkie-talkie and brought it up to his mouth. Sergei did not like this. He kept his eyes on the rear view mirror, watching the armed men. It seemed they were still looking at his car. The beekeeper's unpleasant foreboding was justified 10 minutes later when yet another camouflaged man with a rifle on his chest commanded him with a wave of his hand to pull off onto a shoulder separated from the road by concrete blocks. The man then approached the car, opened the driver's side door, and looked inside. "Where are you going?" he said dryly. Fatigue from the road and fear prevented Sergei from being able to bring his focus to bear. "Taking the bees," he said uncertainly. "Where?" "To Ukraine." "Why would they need your bees?" The man glanced back at the trailer. "They've got their own, don't they?" "I'm from Gray Zone, from Little Starhorodivka," Sergei finally began to explain more clearly. "They have started shooting over there. If I release the bees at home, they might get spooked by the shelling and fly away. I'd lose them." "Ah," the camouflaged man smiled, as if pleased to have learned something new. "So bees are afraid of blasts, are they? Interesting. Have you got your papers?" "I do." Sergei reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "No, no need. I see you are one of ours. You'll have to show them over there to the Yuks, but they might not let you through with the hives. Have you got papers for the bees too?" Sergei grew confused. "No. Do I need them?" "Who the hell knows?" the man shrugged. "Hey, got any cigs?" "I don't smoke." "All right, go on. You might even make it by end of day," the man with the rifle said, ending their chat on a peaceful note. Much relieved, Sergei started the engine and returned to the lane narrowed by the concrete pyramids. Soon the pyramids disappeared, but after another 1.5 kilometers or so, he ran up against a queue of cars. Next to the cars stood people, some in pairs, some in groups of 5, all of them talking and looking up the road. He got out, approached the driver of Tavria directly ahead of him and asked, "What is this? The queue to leave?" The driver, who was smoking beside his car, turned round. "Yes, this one's for leaving, and then there is another to enter." The man explained to Sergei how it all worked, how they would examine his papers, the customs check, and so on. He also told him about the preferential queue. "Do they let category 2 disabled people in that one?" Sergei asked, his eyes lighting up. "Probably," the man sighed thoughtfully. "They let all kinds of disabled people in. Give it a try." Maybe I will stop here.
Thank you, Andrei. And then we will hear now the 2 very short paragraphs from Catch the Rabbit.
I must have been driving through Slovenia for half an hour when I realized that Bosnia had stayed far behind us a country ago. Perhaps because I could still feel her between us, as if we had driven through cinders. We're always in Bosnia. Now we were spreading her all over Europe. Our country, with its irreconcilable borders, was in fact borderless. We had fought for nothing, killed each other over nothing. We were never inside that country. She is the one inside us, like a phantom itch. Our skin bleeds from futile scratching. Once, Michael and I watched a sci-fi series in which a boy is kidnapped by alien beasts and taken to their world of darkness and despair. In the end, he is saved and goes back home to his desperate mother. However, in the last episode, when the boy goes to the bathroom to wash his hands, he feels sick all of a sudden and starts throwing up into the wash basin, vomiting those same parasites that had taken him. There is no more cleanness for him. As I watched the scared boy on Michael's big TV screen, I realized that I knew the feeling, but I didn't say anything. Michael wouldn't have understood anyway.
Thank you so much. So, to our audience, if you have any questions for the authors or our researchers, please go ahead and write them to us via chat. We will have a few more minutes. Meanwhile, I would like to ask Sabine for something like a final word from our side.
Well, I can try for a final word. Well, first of all, what I earlier already mentioned, that this idea for this forum, Nenad and I made because we wanted to bring into discussion together the post-Yugoslav and the post-Soviet experiences. And it is always all too short, and it connects to a workshop we plan in October, where we want to continue the discussion also with researchers about the comparison or linkages and relations between these processes. So yeah, maybe this, I don't know if Nenad wants to add something, and maybe related to borders, when we were talking now about borders, and then also related to this 30-year post-Soviet years. I think that somehow it showed that we for a long time we thought that this is a stable post-Soviet peaceful disintegration, and somehow now it seems to be not so stable, and we have this developments in Ukraine, and we have this, well, initially peaceful disintegration that turns out now that we have a lot of border region that are well, more or less delineated border regions where people are very estranged from each other. And maybe this is also similar and interesting question to compare with the post-Yugoslav case. And yeah, there are many cases we also do not have in our mind. There's not only Ukraine, where we see this, especially also in the Russian-Ukrainian borderland, where people were for a long time very good in contact, but now it's really a hard border, and it becomes almost alien. But there are more cases if we look at the Fergana Valley, where we don't see that now in the news, but there are also continuously border conflicts in the making about resources and different issues. So I think it will remain a dynamic process.
Thank you, Sabine. Nina, would you like to add something?
Sabine said everything, what is also important to me, so I have nothing to add.
Okay, great. So I can't see any questions from the audience, but I would have a question that would go to both authors. I would like to know how your respective novels were met, well, in the audience in your home countries. It's maybe a little bit more difficult for Lana to answer, because you just mentioned that there were at least three different editions in the post-Yugoslav space. But maybe you could say a few words about this, Lana, and then also Andre. Lana, maybe you start.
Well, I mean, when Andrei said that some people in Russia call him a traitor, I've had the same experience in my hometown of Banja Luka, because I'm a Serbian woman writing about what some of the Serbian army did to Muslim people in my hometown. So there was some silence and not a lot of really things going on. Unfortunately, I don't think that books are as important as they used to be. I don't think anybody is going to burn our books, or, you know, maybe in some small circles, but unfortunately, I don't think they have the impact that they used to have. Now they're just ignored. And I mean, I come from a country where very important writers, much bigger and more important than me, are not getting the attention that they need, local writers. Whereas, for example, recently we had the statue of Peter Handke erected in Banja Luka, which is ridiculous to have a German writer in this small Serbian town for solely political reasons. I don't think the people who paid for that statue ever read Handke. So that is the you know, context that I knew I was in, and that I knew I was writing there. At the same time, in Croatia, my book was not my latest book, not chosen to be bought for libraries, because it's not written in purely Croatian dialect. So there's like, this is something that's been going on. I don't think I'm the only one who deals with this, but as Andrei said, as long as we think, I want to write about people, I'm not writing about Serbs and Croats, I'm writing about people, I'm interested in the human story. And if we keep on that track, forgetting all this white noise of who calls us a traitor and who doesn't want to publish us, I think we're doing what we are supposed to be doing. So I'm trying to keep that in my head.
Thank you, Lana. Andre.
Well, I had several reviews, not many reviews, several reviews which were positive, and one negative review which was awarded as the best criticism by a young critic. And in this negative review, I mean, I was accused that I made my characters are not heroes. They're not heroes of Ukrainian army. They are not heroes, and they're not really Ukrainian patriots. They are more like separatists. They are more like people who don't care about Ukraine. And also, this review ended that probably this book will be translated in many languages and liked abroad because it is about humanism. At the same time, the play based on the first part of the book is always sold out, and people are coming. Although it's a drama, it's not a comedy, and people are coming all the time and crying and sort of suffer together with the characters. So I'm happy with the response, and I mean, it's not a bestseller in Ukraine. I would say, I mean, play probably can be called bestseller, the theater play, but not the book. I mean, generally, many people don't want to read books like this.
Okay, thank you so much for this last insights. And if there are no other questions, I think we will leave it here. Our time is up. We were really good in time. I would like to remind the mostly German audience that we have this wonderful books in German and really good German translations in Fangenhasen and Graue Bienen. So if you haven't got them yet, go out and ask for them at your local book dealer. I would like to thank both of the authors and my colleagues for coming and sharing their thoughts with us. I wish you all a very nice evening and looking forward to seeing you at the next SOAS event. So take care and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.